Hey everyone, Raptorspank here, and today we have Metacheck December 22nd. This is the show where I look at the meta and talk about a couple of decks I find interesting. First, let's do a quick update on STP Control that I did a deck guide for last week. Link above and in the description if you'd like to check it out for yourself. But I haven't played quite as much of this as some other decks, I would say. Or about the same, but I've been playing a bunch of different decks, but I've gone 4 and 2 with this deck since my last recording. So that's a 67% win rate since recording, which does bring it to a total of 11 and 7, which is 61% win rate. Now, there's a number of changes I discussed making at the time with the deck guide, and I went ahead with a number of those. Namely, I've cut an Eclipse Dragon for Divergent Paths just to make sure that I can hit that peak. And then I have actually kept the Atrocities in, but then I've dropped Hapless Aristocrat for Spacey Sketcher, and then I've dropped, I've dropped 2 Spacey Sketchers essentially, and the Hapless Aristocrat for 3 Solari Soldiers. So let's talk about a couple of things first. I talked about getting rid of Atrocity and it being kind of a bad card, and I did that, and I went 2 and 2 with the deck, and I've been 2-0 since putting Atrocity back in, including a win that was an Atrocity win. It's just so good for this deck. We are so ahead of our opponents in value that I think the Atrocity is just too good. It does create some bad hands, it does create some bad Targon's Peak moments, but all in all, I think Atrocity just is that good for the deck that we can't really get rid of it without really hurting the deck's ability to win. Divergent Paths, it's a one-of, so it's not a huge change, but I am much more consistently hitting Targon's Peak and getting the Targon's Peak, and there are some times when Divergent Paths is just going to be really great as removal because, I mean, Grand Plaza is seeing a lot of play right now, and Star Spring does still exist. It's pretty fringe at the moment, but it does still exist, so being able to destroy landmarks can actually be extremely relevant. The biggest thing that I'm a little bit disappointed with is potentially one Eclipse Dragon, because multiple Eclipse Dragons had been so powerful for me at multiple times, but it really hasn't been a problem. Oh, another change I made is I dropped 1 Solari Priestess for Solari Shieldbearer. Shieldbearer is just really good, especially with much more mid-range and aggro in the matchup that are in the meta, that being able to have that 3-6 to 3-2 is very strong and very useful for dealing with a lot of different decks right now. So I find it actually more useful than Solari Priestess, even though I did mention how in the deck guide we kind of wanted things like Priestess and Sketcher to get Celestials out early to basically power up the late game of Celestials. It hasn't been a huge problem with this yet, but I still need to play this a lot more to very confidently say that the change is better. But I have had some parts where it's a little bit sketchier to get the Great Beyond to kill our opponent, but Atrocity helps to make up for that, and I think this is probably one of the better ways to have the list. Soldier is in here now because, again, it is just a huge body for 1 mana. A 3-3 is really strong. It can get some early chunk damage in so that Ledros can kill our opponent. But just in general, it is a really good drop, both on aggro and on defense. It's great for dealing with things like Misfortune, because if they swing, this can trade with her usually if you played it that turn. So it's just a really good 1-drop that just carries more value than the other options we were relying on the time. So I think it's a change for the better. I've been very happy with it, but again, very small sample size, so that's still verdict's still out essentially. But I think this is the best place to have the deck right now. I think you want the Atrocities. I think the 1-drops could be a little bit better with Solari Soldier just to hold off the early game. And dropping 1 Solari Priestess I think is pretty good because, generally speaking, there's some great stuff that Priestess can get, but it often ended up being a fairly bad turn 3. And Written in Stars is actually not something we really want a ton of, or the Warrior, so there was a lot of whiffs with like Warrior and the Traveler's not very great in our shell, so yeah, it's generally speaking, I think this has improved the deck somewhat, and I think it's still in very good shape, and the fact that it's gone up to a 61% win rate, and in fact in the recent games 67%, again small sample size, but I think that's starting to show that the deck can actually perform a little bit better than it had done while I was still experimenting with it. So yeah, it's a really fun deck that does some very unique things, and something I would still recommend fairly highly, even if I have been sort of swinging a little bit more to aggro myself. But just to give a general, or move into the general thoughts for the meta, I think the meta's in a pretty diverse and stable spot right now that is pretty fun to play. Not gonna lie. I know some people have been complaining about Grand Plaza, especially, but I've seen some complaints about Targon's Peak too. I don't think Peak's a problem. Maybe if more people adopted my list or a list similar to it, it might become a problem. But so far, I have not really been concerned with Targon's Peak. I think I've run into it maybe twice, and I think I've won both times. But I don't think that's a problem. Grand Plaza, I think there's a little more argument for, but I personally am not concerned about Grand Plaza. I've had some people ask me about it, but I think it's actually slowed down a lot of the decks that run it. I think that maybe paired with Noxus, it's a little bit scarier, but that's hard to say because that deck hasn't really broken into the meta. We'll talk about that later in the episode. It's one of the decks for this week, but realistically speaking, it's actually slowed Banner Scouts down quite a bit. So, speaking of peak control, the decks I'd played against, I beat and burn. I beat this sort of Leona, Zoe, Lux, kind of Invoke, Celestial midrange. I beat Fiora combo, but I beat Banner Scouts. And what I noticed in that Banner Scouts matchup is that Grand Plaza has actually made that matchup a lot easier for control. Before, you're just kind of hoping you can make it to the Ruination before they killed you. Now, with them doing nothing on turn 3, essentially, just dropping this landmark, you actually have a lot more time to get going and a lot more opportunities to start playing things, because then they go into the next turn where they're going to play a unit which is going to get the buff and the challenger, and then you can play something like Leona to stun it or something like that, and that can be enough time to just buy you to the board wipe turn. And by that point they should have burned out most of their resources, so the board wipe should be pretty effective at keeping them down. So I have noticed that matchup's actually way easier for control than it used to be, because they used to be an aggro deck that kind of was mid-rangey. Now they're definitely a mid-range deck with Grand Plaza, so I really don't think that card's as much of a problem as other people have been saying, but I have to play more before I can confidently say that. But I've been kind of stomping Plaza decks with peak control, with Decisive Aggro I've been playing a bit of again. I don't think it's as big of a problem as other people think it does, or think it is, and I think it has created some decks. I think Grand Plaza has been a good addition. I don't think it's an auto-include, even though it's the most played Demacia card currently. I don't think it's been the problem, and I think it has opened up possibilities. It's made Banner Scouts more of a mid-rangey deck, so the Demacia mid-range is going to be a little bit better. I mentioned Noxus. I think there really is a place for Demacia Noxus aggro, essentially, because things like House Spider work exceptionally good with Plaza, so I like that it's created the possibility for these other decks. Honestly, if there's a card I was to complain the most about right now in the meta, it would be Zoe. I really don't like her and what she accomplishes, and the fact that once she levels up, her ability is just permanent. Whether she lives or not, it just continues to happen, and it can be very problematic very quickly. But I'm not ready to say that she's a bad card for the meta, that she's really unhealthy and a huge problem yet. But she's definitely a card that I don't like to see. It's probably more than anything else. Victor can be a bit problematic too, but Victor decks are kind of fun. I'm not gonna lie, having seen and run into Victor quite a lot. So that's another thing. If you are playing right now in ranked, I would come prepared to deal with Victor, because I've seen a ton of Victor decks. So I think that will start to peter off because I've been winning most of those matchups. So there's a good chance that Victor's not particularly great, but a lot of people have been playing it. So that's something to keep in mind. But generally speaking, this meta is way better than what we had at the start of Monuments of Power, and this expansion has really shaken up the meta a lot more than Monuments of Power. Grand Plaza is a great card. Targon's Peak is a great card. Zoe is a great card. We're seeing a lot more happen than happened before, and that is something that I am exceptionally happy with. I was pretty disappointed with Monuments of Power, especially considering the fact that we're stuck with the same meta for a whole entire month, and I am less worried about that now because this is a very different meta at least, so you're going to get very different games than you got before, though there are still plenty of holdovers from the previous meta that are still good, and we're going to talk about 2 of them today. So let's just start with that right now, and let's talk about Go Hard Midrange. I've noticed this deck. I haven't run into it a ton. I have seen it, I think, maybe once or twice. I lost to it with P Control in the deck guide. If you checked out that video, that happened. But generally speaking, I haven't seen a ton of it yet. But I know Mobalytics just posted their meta snapshot essentially, and this was the most played deck with a very high win rate, and I could see that still being true. I don't know if I've ever posted this list, but this list is what I would be running if I picked up Go Hard Midrange, and I probably will run it at some point this season, but I think the addition of Commander Ledros is really, really good to the deck, so people who haven't seen this list, this is the list I'm seeing mostly nowadays, and I think this is the best version of it. But basically, this is kind of a tempo-y, mid-rangey deck. It gets called mid-range a lot. I think it really is tempo more than anything else, although this version's kind of a little more control-y, though it does have Elise rather than Gangplank, so that does boost the early game. But generally speaking, it's kind of a deck where you're going to play a bunch of early threats and just put a ton of chip damage into your opponent early while using control spells to clear the board or keep your opponent from out-tempoing you, essentially. And then your late game you close out with things like Ledros or Pack Your Bags, so that's the primary goal of the deck is to do things like that, and you can level up Twisted Fate really easy, but basically you're looking to cast Go Hard a bunch and then keep drawing copies using things like Zap Sprayfin, Salvage, Twisted Fate, Fortune Croaker to just keep hitting it so you can pack your bags multiple times a game just to kill your opponent outright, and Ledros does help you get to that point. So against aggro decks, you're going to want to keep a lot of early drops to slow them down. Against things like discard aggro, if you do run into that, haven't seen much of it myself, but if you do, Twisted Fate is great as a board wipe. Even against other aggro decks, you can be good for that if you can get away with a deckhand into Twisted Fate without them killing the keg. Go Hard is really great in this matchup. Grasp of the Undying, the one of, is fairly good too. Vile Feast can be really great because that's all of your life gain is going to be pretty good. Go Hard being the best because you're going to get a lot of life off of it because you keep finding it and drawing it. So that's what you're looking for in the aggro matchups. Against mid-range, you're going to look for things like Ruination, Vengeance is good, and then just your larger size units that are going to brick things for your opponent. Twist of Fate can be used to stun things here. Ledros is just a great finisher for that, but you would never want to keep it in your opening hand. You just really want to look for things like Ruination especially. Against control, that's where you want to go aggro. You want to go heavily aggressive. You want lots of things like Jagged Butcher, and you probably play that on turn 1 even without being able to trigger it. Dreadway Deckhand should be good. Elise is fantastic. Things like that just to try and get as much damage in early, and then hopefully you can force them to place enough units that you can go hard and get a Pack Your Bags, and hopefully that should close out the game. If not, Ledros great into this, so that's the big things you want to look for in that matchup. But generally speaking, I think this could still be good. I don't think it's quite as good in the meta as it was before, but I haven't been playing it myself, so I can't say that confidently. But generally speaking, I don't think this is quite as oppressive as it was. Maybe we'll see the meta swing back that way as time goes on, but I do see this deck being probably worse against mid-range, and with a lot of Grand Plaza out there right now, I think it might struggle into those matchups. But again, haven't played the deck myself since the new expansion, so that's take that with a grain of salt. But I think it's definitely a good deck to still be playing. I think you can definitely get away with it. So if you're interested in that kind of gameplay, great list to go with. The next deck I want to talk about is one that's a little more near and dear to my heart personally, because this is what got me to Masters last season, and it's similar to another deck that got me to Masters in Season 3, I think is what that was. But that's Decisive Aggro. I love this aggro deck. It's just really fun. It's very resistant to damage, essentially. You have a lot of big units, although if you've seen the last list that I showed for this, and the list I have now, you'll notice that mine is a little more fragile with a lot of 1-drops, but This deck has done well for me. I've only put I think 5 games into the deck, but it's 4-1, so I mean it's doing great win rate wise. I think that's 80% off the top of my head. Um, but deck is great. It's really fun. It's really neat. Darius is a great closeout. Crowd favorite's actually a lot better than you expect it to be in this deck, and Decisive Maneuver is just so insane. And then I've kept the Decimates to close out. The big difference between the old list I had is I dropped 3 Whirling Deaths for 3 Legion Saboteurs. Where the meta's been shifting, the late game is getting scarier. There's a lot of great payoff things with stuff like Targon's Peak and Grand Plaza, so I've been trying to speed up my deck, and that's worked exceptionally well. The loss came before that change, for example. So since making that swap, I haven't lost anything yet, though I've had some very close calls, but Legion Saboteur just won me a game earlier today where it did 1 damage to my opponent's Nexus when they were at 1, and they had like a Captain Farron out in the Gangplank, so it was like, if this doesn't kill them, I lose, but they'd used up their Noxian Fervors. I was outside of lethal range, so Saboteur carried it through even though it couldn't actually connect. So I'm loving that change. Speeding up the deck is very important. It will be weaker against go hard mid range probably now since Legion Saboteur dies very easily to go hard. Same with Precious Pet from before. So we do have that might be a little bit worse. Although we do still have our large units. It's just Whirling Death could be very good in that matchup because they often didn't have a way to kill your units at fast speed without vengeance. The one of Grasp of the Undying kind of changes that, but generally speaking, they couldn't kill your units, so it was very easy to set up a Draven, Spinning Axe, Whirling Death for an instant level up. So not having that can weaken that matchup, but generally speaking, I found this to be much better in the meta than the Whirling Death version, but it is still insanely good. Against other aggro decks, you just kind of want to run them down as fast as you can, but you can do a couple of other things, like Solari Soldier and Shield Bearer let you play defensive very easily and very well against them. Decisive Maneuver can be used defensively. I'm always trying to set up the Decisive Maneuver kill against Burn and other aggro decks, and generally speaking, I'm going to be honest, I almost always end up casting it defensively, and it feels bad every time I do it, but it wins me the game. It just does, because I can stun their biggest unit. In that matchup I said where Saboteur killed them, at 2 different intervals, I Decisive Maneuvered to stun their Gangplank and basically cut all their damage. I would have gone down to like 6, and instead I was at 11, which is insane. And I killed a number of their units because of the buff off Decisive Maneuver, and that was with an early misfortune out of them. And then I stunned that same Captain Farron when it went to swing, and that bought me all the time necessary to play Saboteur and get that 1 extra point of damage through. So it's really good on the defensive. So keeping 1 Decisive Maneuver can be very good against other aggro decks, but generally speaking, you want to be really low to the ground and fast, and you want a lot of durable threats so that you can start setting up these things, where it's like turn 1 Solari Soldier is going to deal 3 damage because they're not going to block it, and even if they did, it's going to eat whatever they block, and you're still going to have a soldier out of it. So it's really powerful to have units like that into the burn matchups and aggro matchups. Against mid-range, you're going to want a lot of Overwhelm. Overwhelm's going to be very relevant. You might want some early game, too, with stuff like Saboteur. Draven is good because that's one-sided, essentially. You should be killing their stuff, and they should have a hard time killing your stuff. Decisive Maneuver is great for setting up the Wombo combo kill, essentially. That's where you're going to be playing it aggressively. You're going to stun their blocker to get more Overwhelm damage through, and then buff all your units, and that should, and often can, kill the mid-range deck right then and there. So that's the big thing you're looking for. Decimate can also be used to close out the game, but I wouldn't keep any in your openers. Against Control, aggro, be fast, be quick, play a lot of tough units for them to kill. Things like Crescent Guardian can be good, Iron Ballista can be good, Darius is really good, Decimate can close out the late game, but again, you're fine top decking that, so don't keep it. Pale Cascade can be really great for keeping your stuff alive through removal, so that's another thing to keep in mind. But generally speaking, you just want to be pedal to the metal, run them down as fast as you can, and be willing to keep more durable threats too. But yeah, it's a really great deck. I love this deck. It got me to Masters. The old Harrowing variant of it is what I used to get to Masters in Season 3, I think, as well. Yeah, Darius has been a great card to me over the course of this year. So this is just a really fun aggro deck. It's the one I've been enjoying the most right now, and I think it's probably the most competitive one outside of like a Grand Plaza deck, maybe. But realistically speaking, this deck has been outperforming my Grand Plaza deck. So let's talk about that deck next, as kind of the spicier deck for this week. But this is Demacian Noxus. Grand Plaza Riven, essentially. I mentioned this briefly in the last Metacheck, but here's the actual list that I'm running at the moment. I've kind of talked with other people, seen where they're at in it, tried different things. I tried Precious Pet instead of Saboteur. This is where I'm at. I've only played 4 games of this in Ranked. I don't remember how many I've played in Normals, but I've gone 2-2 in Ranked. Not exactly where I want it to be, but again, this list has been heavily changing. I've had so many different things in it. I think I had a Riposte at one point. I had Genevieve instead of Cythria. I had Precious Pet instead of Saboteur. It's changed a lot. The big strong points in this deck is House Spider with Grand Plaza is actually insane. That's 5 power on the board right then and there for 2 mana. It follows Grand Plaza beautifully, and it lets you set up perfect attacks because it's 2 challengers for only 2 mana. It's insane. It's crazy good. And you can pair it up with other stuff fairly easily, like Lucian, for example. And you could just leave up stuff like Sharp Sight in single combat too. It's just really, really great. This deck can be very, very fast. Kato the Arm is very hard to deal with. Cythria the Bold is very hard to deal with. The one of Captain Farron's there mostly just to close the game out. We don't even necessarily expect Captain Farron to be able to connect, but it's basically for control matchups especially that we can drop that and then use Decimate to close out the last few points of damage to win the game essentially. But yeah, generally speaking, this is just an attack as often as possible. Riven is solid in this list, even without having any Reforge options, because we can attack often. Things like Grizzled Ranger and Relentless Pursuit, as well as a level up Lucian, can give us multiple attacks a turn, which will give us multiple Reforges a turn. And then our Reforges can just help us to break the symmetry by giving stuff like Quick Attack, Overwhelm, etc. Overwhelm can be really good with stuff like Senna and Lucian, which is why we have the one of Might, because they get double attack, and then they can deal a ton of damage very quickly. And in fact, things like Grand Plaza can actually help us use Senna to level up Lucian, or Lucian to level up Senna, by forcing those units to die, essentially, by hitting something big, and then they die, they level up the other one, so it has double attack, and since we probably have Challenger, we can force that double attack through to deal a ton of damage. It can kill your opponent very quickly out of nowhere, and that's the other reason we're running Kato the Arm, primarily, is to give Overwhelm to Lucian or Senna when they have double attack. So it's just a really fun aggro deck. Against other aggro decks, you just kind of want to go wide a bit, with things like House Spider, and then Grizzled Ranger should be good too because it can die twice. Grand Plaza can be good for setting up very good blocks for yourself, so you can kill a lot of your opponent's stuff. You can use things like Lucian and Senna to just one-sided remove things. There's just a lot of great things if you try to go for more of a slower mid-rangey go wide approach. Against mid-range, you're probably going to want to go quick, try to go fast. Prioritize things like Lucian, and Grand Plaza House Spider is actually really good in that matchup because of the fact that you can kill a lot of their things with the House Spiders. Cythria the Bold and Captain Farron should be fairly decent closeouts. Kato can be pretty good too, but generally speaking, you're going to want to be a lot faster in this matchup. Maybe keep Sharp Sights as well. Relentless Pursuit should be good. But yeah, you're definitely the aggro deck in that matchup. Against Control, similarly, you're just going to want to run them down as fast as possible. Grand Plaza can be used to keep your stuff safer, although be aware that Ruination can be a real risk against the Shadow Isle one, so play around that correctly. But generally speaking, use Grand Plaza to force extra damage through when you can, and just try to run them down very quickly. It's actually a pretty fun deck. I'm still not sure if it's good or not. It's still very much a verdict still out. I'm workshopping this list a lot when I'm playing it. I've been playing more Decisive Aggro, but this is a very fun deck, and I think it's very close to finally breaking through as a Demacian Noxus deck. This has always kind of flirted with the meta, but never been more than a fringe deck. I think this has a decent chance. Maybe Riven's a little bit weird. Maybe something like Katarina would be better, but generally speaking, I think this list has a lot of potential and it's very, very fun, so well worth checking out. So, thanks for watching the video. There's a link for all 3 of these decks in the description below if you want to give them a try. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, comment below, and subscribe for more videos just like it.